some general
Mm-hmm.
questions, and then going to ask a few more personal ones.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be good just to begin with understanding more about what you want to change in the system within which you work.
I want to change. It's quite difficult because I don't work in with one system. So one of the big things that I'm looking to change in systems is the current paradigm. So we are currently working in a very consumptionist-based paradigm, and that doesn't align with sustainability. So although that feels like a very big vision, we're trying to look at how you do that through food and energy and more specific areas.
And so when you're working, let's say, take food as a system or energy as a system, what are you wanting to change within the food system or the energy system?
So each system operates in a slightly different way, and we're trying to understand where the best leverage is for the change and how to use our capacity as an organisation who works with big business to join big business with kind of new ideas and new processes.
And so you're wanting to change the way that business operates?
Overall, yes, we're trying to look at how business operates within the current system and how it can use its power and energy for a better future.
And how important is it for you to articulate a vision of the future?
I think there's a difference between articulating a very clear vision that has tangible outcomes and a vision that is aspirational and is more principle-based, and I think the second is far more important. We need to articulate visions that are about our aspiration, the principles of the future. So instead of saying we need a certain reduction in energy, we can start talking about the need to have access to energy, and it's based on visionary principles rather than visionary, tangible, measurable, because that seems to reduce the level of change.
And can you give any examples of where you've used those kind of aspirational visions in your work?
So in the food system, we're looking at how to make a resilient supply chain. We don't know exactly what a resilient supply chain might look like. So it's through the exploration that we're trying to work out the tangible ways to make that happen.
And are you using any particular mapping tools for that?
At Forum for the Future, we use tools like Futures predominantly to understand the big systemic questions. We also use system mapping tools and sustainability frameworks. But where the magic starts happening is when you start bringing people together and you start facilitating them in conversations and collaborations and coalitions to find new innovations for change.
And that leads nicely on to strategies and tactics. So what are the strategies and tactics that you use to change systems?
At Forum, we have a number of different strategies for creating change. We call it system innovation overall, but ultimately it's about diagnosing the system, understanding where the players are and what they need to do, and then finding places to pioneer and innovate. And we do that through a number of different methodologies. And then we look at how we can scale up the change. But ultimately, it's how those three things intersect together and how you bring people together to create that change.
And can you give a few more details about the kinds of methodologies and tactics that you're using?
So there's 3 or 4 processes that we use at Forum. The first one is big collaborative futures projects. So the Sustainable Shipping Initiative was where we brought together industry leaders across shipping to vision and understand what kind of future they wanted in the shipping industry, and then to decide the innovations and work streams that they wanted to start instigating and experimenting around. We've just recently spun that off into its own entity. So the exit strategy for us as an organisation was to set up a body that could keep driving forward the change. That's taken about 4 years to do. Another process we look at is much more fast breakthrough innovation processes, where we just take a problem and we create coalitions or work streams around it that might break through into new ideas. And then we're also looking at how we might scale up, so understanding the process of where the system might tip. And that is the hardest process of all. We haven't quite cracked it yet, and we're trying to really understand why systems are not moving in the right direction. So, for example, we're trying to understand community food initiatives. There's a lot going on in the niche, but it hasn't seemed to have affected the bigger system. So why is it not creating the change, and how might we stimulate the change and to bring the big players in and to mesh that with what's going on?
And what tools are you using to help you with that process?
Most of the tools that we use is the facilitation in the conversation. So although we use futures and innovation tools, as well as communications and finance and digital, it's how we put those together, and it's very based on our experience, but it's also based in the needs of the exact problem. So we've got tools such as our scenario building or our horizon scanning or our people-centred research in innovation, but the main process is actually how we understand the people and how we understand the business and how we bring them together in events, in workshops, in the background chats that we have with them. One of my colleagues said to me once that 60% of her time was just spent in cultivating relationships around the project and phoning people. And I think we underestimate how much that relationship building is a key part of change.
And I was really interested by that earlier point around that you were talking about with community food initiatives, around looking at why some of the niche areas aren't affecting the bigger system. How are you strategizing or conceiving that problem?
At the moment, we're trying to first identify what is happening. So in community food, trying to look at the different initiatives that are on the ground. But then we're also trying to understand the wider current system and the power structures, the power dynamics of how things are operating. And I think there's an assumption when we talk about scaling up that it's just about making community food bigger. But it might be about changing some of the relationships between policy, technology, the big players, and understanding how to realign those relationships. That might seem quite intangible, and I think we're finding it a little intangible at the moment because we don't quite know where there might be a leverage point. We're investigating the role of digital in that. Can you create digital platforms that brings people together? Or is it something more fundamental about how information flows around the system as well?
And as part of that investigative process, are you doing desk research? Are you going out and interviewing people? How are you understanding where the intervention could happen?
We do some desk research. However, a lot of our approach is based in talking to people, in bringing them together, in seeing what happens in the room. So we will prepare ourselves by understanding what's going on, but actually the experts in a lot of these work sits with the people that are doing the projects on the ground. And our role is very much in bringing those people together and asking them questions at the right time and facilitating the conversation of working out what the barriers and opportunities are for change.
And what are the challenges in doing that? So how are other organisations seeing what you're doing?
One of our major challenges is the relationship between big business and where the change needs to happen in the fringes. And how do you bring those two communities together? So one of our big challenge is to try to... I can't, sorry. I'm going Do you want to ask another?
Yes.
Ask it again, or?
So the question was around the challenges in, particularly if we take community food as an example, of convening and how are other organisations understanding what you're doing?
I think most people understand the way we work when we say we offer certain processes. So the tangible pieces of our work will be a futures piece of work or an innovations piece of work. But the intangible thing is more important and is harder to convince people that it's just as a high priority. So the challenge of bringing people together and how you manage those relationships, how you manage the power dynamics, and how you reconfigure those power dynamics so that big businesses are open to new ideas from new entrepreneurs or new technologies, or where the entrepreneurs don't see this as an opportunity just for funding, but they see this as an opportunity for influence, is quite a hard line to walk.
And yeah. Let's have a chat about theories of change. I know this is something you think a lot about. Do you have a theory, one theory of change for your work? And if you do, can you talk me through it?
Personally, I have a strong theory of change based on living systems. And it's based on the principles of how ecology works. So, firstly, ecology is about networks, about nested networks within each other. So we are humans and we live within the wider ecology, and we need to recognise that what emerges affects both the individuals, the person, the societal people, and then the ecology. And so that's quite an embedded notion, and that's quite a strong theory I work with. The second theory is around relationships, is that we are not individuals, that we are all based in how we interact with each other. In ecology, you don't survive as a species if you don't adapt with and around your environment. So that's a really important principle for when you try to create change. When you look at the relationships, you don't look at the individuals, you look at the relationships between the individuals. And the third area is about experimentation and learning. And this, for me, is the fundamental area, is that the way we evolve in ecology is through novelty, is through trying out new ideas, having feedback loops where we learn about those, and then adapting to the environment and to the process. So my theory of change is very much based in we're embedded within nature, we're embedded in different systems, it's based on relationships, and it's based on experimentation and learning.
And how has your theory of change evolved? How have you come to realise that?
I've done quite a bit of studying on systems thinking and systems analysis. A lot of systems theory has come from quite a mechanical worldview, so it assumes that the world can be known, it assumes that the world is an object to understand, whereas a more systemic and ecological worldview is much more about evolution, adapting, ever-changing. And so I think through the studying of that and through the understanding of ecology and recognising that when we talk about sustainability, it is ultimately about ecology and our role within that, created a good base for how we understand system change.
And do you work across lots of different systems? How important do you think it is to have a theory of change if you're doing systems change work?
I think a theory of change is important. I think it's more important to understand why you make certain choices. We don't just create change based in a vacuum. It's really important to understand why you make choices and why you decide to do a certain project, a certain activity, why you decide to get out of bed in a certain way. Because a lot of the current world is based on assumptions around growth. And if we don't unpick those assumptions, we can't change them, and we can't then create a new system. So a theory of change is important to help unravel your assumptions and help you see how to create a different kind of world.
And who are your allies and fellow travellers on this journey?
I think there's two types of travellers. There's the team at Forum and the kind of organisation. And I've been very interested in how you create people with an organisation who have a shared sense of purpose and a shared sense of endeavour. But then there's also the more informal, intangible relationships that you make on a daily basis. And I think those personal relationships, for me, are very important in finding people with similar aspirations and ideas that you call upon at different times.
And let's just talk about culture and systems change. Just when we were coming in and you were talking about how you're now expanding your work to India, to Singapore. How does culture affect the tactics and strategies you use for systems change?
I think culture is extremely important to system change because it's the way in which we collectively identify who we are and why we're here in the world. And ultimately, the current culture in the West has very much been based on how we want to grow, how we want to consume, and it's become a very strong narrative for the world. So we have to understand the culture and the narrative that orientates in different locations and worlds. So in the US, they have a slightly different definition of how they see themselves, and the same happens when you go to India or Southeast Asia. I don't think we've quite identified how to bring that into our work enough. I don't think generically as a system change community we are talking enough about narrative and culture and recognising the importance of that.
I'm going to take a step back and actually talk a bit more about you and your work now. So we've been asking some very general questions, and it would be great just to hear how you describe your work.
I see my work as very much giving permission and giving support to people to create the change that needs to happen. A lot of what I do is based in the idea of learning and experimentation. So enabling people to try out new things, enabling people to take risks, as well as helping them understand why they've done that. So they're learning kind of questions about breaking down their assumptions. So I work on projects. I'm usually a part of lots of different projects. And the thing that I find really exciting is supporting people being change makers. And I see that when I lead the team, when I bring other people and people in together. And I think it's a very subtle skill, but I think it's something that I often feel is missing in system change, that soft allowing people to pursue their sort of aspirations.
And when you meet someone for the first time who's never heard of systems change, how do you talk about the work in a way that is meaningful to them?
So usually when somebody said, what is system change and what are you particularly doing? I might describe a project that you're working on. So you could say there are big challenges in the world, big targets and ideas that we're trying to solve, like poverty or environment and climate change. And we don't always know how to create solutions to those problems. And we don't always know what drives those problems and what lies behind them. So I then talk about my work and say that it's about experimenting. So, for example, working with Nike and how they're trying to innovate and transform their supply chain, moving from a culture of more and more trainers to a culture of service model, but also around projects that are trying to disrupt and ask big questions about society. And so by taking people into stories about the actual work, they start to understand it.
And what do you think is the hardest thing for newcomers to systems change to get about the concept?
I think system change is very... I think one of the hardest things with system change is that it seems very big, and it is. And therefore, we still live in a paradigm where we think we have to understand every step along the way. But if we take a more living systems perspective, you don't have to understand how to get to a vision. You just have to understand how to innovate and how to experiment with that big vision in mind. So you're stretching the boundaries in what you're doing in the very day-to-day. So I think people don't get system change because they think they have to know it and they think they have to understand everything about it. But actually, it's about understanding the bigger framing of it and then knowing how you can make change in that instance and in that project and in what you do on a day-to-day basis.
That's a really great answer.
I've thought about that one a lot.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of link into theory and practice, because I know you've studied this a lot. You're finished? You finished your doctorate?
Not finished it yet.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get my sabbatical next year to finish it.
Yeah, so you're doing your doctorate on this, and I'm really interested in how the intersection between theory and practice in your work. So how do you integrate all of this theory that you're discovering through your academic work into the practical work that you do at Forum?
The approach I take to research is not an academic traditional study. I work with ideas of action inquiry where it's all based in the action. The action is the start and the action is the outcome. But it's the process, the awareness you bring in your mind to that as you're doing that action. So it's about living your life and understanding the choices you make, understanding the assumptions behind it, and in the academic form, writing that down and having some sort of reflective process to do that. So yes, there's reading and there's other ideas you can bring in and other people, but I think the stimulus you get can be from individual people, can get from books. It doesn't have to be traditional academic writing. So I think there's been a big chasm between theory and practice. We think that we can understand system change just by reading it, or that we just can do it. But I like the concept of trying to work with these two things together. How do we do something and stop and reflect about it to do something different? And we just don't create theory and action, and we don't do action and then stop and think about it. And we kind of separate those two worlds out a bit too much.
And how do you bring them together on a very practical basis? Are there particular reflective processes that you use? How do you create that space for theory and action?
So on a very day-to-day basis, I do have kind of a notebook that I can write down thoughts and ideas. And there's usually some sort of question or some sort of idea I'm working with at any one time. And it's about watching for those things and understanding them. But it's also setting about some time to stop and reflect on that action. So at the moment, I spend 2 or 3 hours every fortnight just stopping and reviewing those notes and saying, what have they taught me? And then it's about saying, what do I need to do differently? And having some easily accessible front-of-mind ideas that you can bring into your practice. So it's not a case of acting, then stopping and reflecting. Sometimes it's a case of acting, and as you're doing that, asking yourself the question, is this moving towards the right direction? What am I learning here? And being able to watch yourself in action as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And are you seeing other organisations or individuals trying to do this? So trying to find a space for theory and action?
I think a lot of the action inquiry field does do that. I still don't think it's a robust field, though. And I still don't think we've been able to crack how you learn in action and how you make it useful for the action. And so I think a lot of people see learning processes as a burden rather than as something that's really exciting and useful to the change that they're trying to create. So that's one of my personal objectives, is to really understand the appropriate learning infrastructure that helps us create better change, rather than learning structures that feel cumbersome and knowledge management-like. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think there needs to be a way to create learning as an exciting, everyday event, rather than sitting in a boring library somewhere.
And it was nice that you described some very practical elements there, because that's one of the things we're really interested in, is actually what's the day-to-dayness of systems change. So it'd be really great if you could just describe what you did last week. In an effort for us to understand, okay, we've got the language of systems change, which can sometimes feel quite intangible. What is it that people do when they're working in this area?
What I did last week. So there was 3 things I was focusing on last week. I was focusing on how do you help a group of businesses and foundations see the problem of scaling up their impact? How do you help them understand that it's not just a case of giving them a piece of paper and telling them the answer? So there's this really interesting tension between, do we write a publication about the lessons we've learned, or are we actually about convening the people? So we're running workshops, so we were planning the workshop last week, and trying to understand how you bring people on from where they are, but how do you also stretch them to where they need to be. So there's kind of planning processes, design processes of facilitation events, but also trying to write that up in an engaging way. And also investigating new forms of engagement and communication that might get at the real barrier to why people don't things, which is much more cultural and hidden. Something else I was doing last week was more internal in the organisation, but it's also, I think, really important. It's how do we get the team to think about what they're doing next year? And I spend a lot of time just meeting the team and having coffee and talking to people, and just finding out where they're at and finding out what their aspirations are, and trying to talk to them about how that does fit or doesn't fit with what we're trying to do. And I think sometimes we assume when we write things down that we all know what it means, but actually it's in the conversations you can get a shared sense of meaning. And I think, I can't remember what else I did last week. And that's those two things.
and going back to the first one,
yeah.
Can you just talk a bit more about the practicalities of what you were doing? So were you convening a meeting? Were you doing research? Were you having coffees with people when it came to the work with foundations around impact?
So last week I was doing interviews on the phone with people, one-to-one interviews, preparing them for a workshop we have in 2 weeks' time. So we don't probably host workshops every week, but there's a lot of work that goes into bringing people together and ensuring when they do come together, they are already up to speed and you're using that time in the room really productively. There's also some framing and research about the content that you'll be presenting at different workshops, ensuring that you're getting the messages correct. And then there's bringing your team on board and ensuring that they are sharing the same messages, that we are helping each other refine and create a better output.
And we've talked a lot about collaboration and convening, and we're really interested in understanding your relationship to other organisations. So how easy is it to collaborate with other organisations? What are some of the challenges? Are there certain kinds of organisations that it's easier to work with than others? I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
I think you've hit on a very strong problem at the moment, is understanding collaboration, understanding partnerships, and why people do and don't come together. And I think sometimes the current organisational forms, so we need to put our organisation above the change that we are creating, can get in the way. At a workshop a couple of weeks ago, we were talking with businesses about the problem between collaboration and competition. What issues can we work on collaboratively, and what issues are behind the competitive door? And I just don't think we've cracked it. I think it is a real question that doesn't just work for businesses, but also works for other change makers. When we try to work, we're trying to look at working across the circular economy, and there are different organisations in that space. We all would like to do something there, but we can't quite find the right route to showing the skill base that we have and the capabilities we have, and how they might offer something different. Because we are also competing for funding. So the business model and the funding and the money that drives us kind of keeps us in the current system, which I think is really interesting, that our current system, part of the financial problems of this world, are because we're driving growth, and they are also keeping us in the change makers world, also in the current system, by not opening up the doors for collaboration.
And essentially there you've been describing a kind of collective impact approach, something to aspire to, and then saying that funding models are making that hard. Are there any areas where it's easy, where for some peculiarity of funding or another reason that collaboration isn't difficult and there isn't that competition?
I think it's easier to collaborate if it's very obvious that you're different. So I think collaborations across the supply chain or collaborations between an agency and an NGO, you can say this is your role and this is my role. I think where the collaborations are harder is where we think we're in a more competitive space. But it's still difficult, ultimately.
And what do you think are some of the solutions that are needed to make that collaboration easier?
I don't think we've got the solutions to make collaboration better at the moment. The obvious one, although I think the undervalued one, is just time and effort in relationship building. But I think there are some areas that I'm hoping to look at over the next year to understand what's really going on behind some of these collaborations, and why they're effective and why they're not. So, and ultimately, I don't have an answer.
And we've talked quite a lot about challenges. Like, on a personal level, you're working with lots of different systems, and I imagine, the kinds of problems that you're wanting to solve are very different. What are personally some of the biggest challenges you're facing in your work for the next year?
Can you just hold that for a second?
What are the...
What are your challenges on a personal level with your work for the next year?
I think my personal challenge is really about the line between the current system and the system you're trying to create. I think we've touched on it a bit, where we're looking at funding in the current system and needing new forms of organisation for the new system. And I think on a daily basis, be it taking my kid to a school and the school system not looking at how we work. I feel it on a very day-to-day basis as a mother, but I also feel it as an organisation where where people in the organisation are trying to create disruptive change, but other people in the organisation to ensure that we're still around as an organisation. And then at the big systems level, you're talking about the big six and energy and how they're dominating what's happening, but actually how do you break through with new technologies? So that question is a really strong one for me at the moment, is that bridge between the current system and the new system, and the tension of power, the tension of it not sitting well with you personally and it making unease in you when you start noticing it.
And that links on, you've spoken about kind of some very concrete examples. It'd just be good to hear a bit more about any practical examples of systems change in action.
I'm trying to think what is a good example. Because I've got loads, but I was just trying to think what's the kind of a nice little story that... I think sometimes we think system change is about the massive projects and the big collaborations, and it is, and it can be. But there's something about system change that is in the individual and it's in the way that they think and the way that they act. I'm not quite sure what the example is that I want to kind of bring out there, because for me personally, I take it back when people ask me what is system change for you. I sometimes take it through the hard road I've had to go through over the last 4 years of becoming a mother, and saying that system change is dealing with the transition, the transformation that I've been through, still living within a world that doesn't accept the kind of new forms of motherhood, of community, that doesn't necessarily work for you, but sometimes works against you. And so system change can be, as a practitioner, can be very much in that very day-to-day. How do you navigate that? How do you work with that? But your question was about big kind of system change projects or stories?
Not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
That's a very concrete example and a way of making it, helping people understand the process more.
Yeah. I think the big example for Forum is about the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. the collaboration of 20 businesses across the sector, from insurance to shipbuilders to people who use ships to port their cargo around the world. And we've taken 4 years to launch a new organisation. The change hasn't been created, but this organisation is now going to sort of go forth and try to create the change. So how we measure system change is quite interesting, because the exit strategy might be about putting in self-reinforcing processes that will continue the change, rather than having created the system change. In Buddhism, they talk about no change will be created until we all create it. So I don't think we'll get to the level of system change we're all requiring until the system itself flips. So we can't speak of this has happened, and we won't reach sustainability until we all reach it. So therefore it's sometimes hard to talk about great system change examples, because we're all striving for outcomes that are very aspirationally similar, but we're not all going to get there individually. We're going to have to get there together.
And how do you keep yourself motivated, given you've talked about having these enormous goals that are very hard to achieve, and different ways of understanding impact? On a day-to-day and perhaps slightly more longer-term basis, how do you keep yourself motivated and inspired to do this work?
What motivates me most is the relationship between the big picture, knowing that you're working towards something that really means something to you, articulating that as a personal purpose as well. So it's shifted over the years, but it's just revisiting and coming back to what's the question I'm following at the moment? What's the idea that's really grabbing me that will help me understand how to reach the bigger change that I'm seeking? And I think what motivates me is understanding my skills and capabilities and what I can contribute, and not thinking that I can do it all myself.
You spoke before about unease when you were describing motherhood as a kind of metaphor for system change. We've talked quite a lot of theory and strategy, but I'm quite interested in the emotion and feelings of systemic change. Can you talk a bit about how systems change feels on a day-to-day basis, just on an emotional level?
I think system change really engages both your head and your heart, but also this idea of your gut, your will. And I think with issues like climate change, I don't think we have recognised how much it's making us feel a bit sick and ill at the world. So system change can make you feel quite ill when you recognise the enormity of the problem. But if you flip that and say, what can I do? How can I act from that place? And to think about it as what drives me to do change, you can then incorporate that sense of excitement and bring that back into how you feel about the world and how you think about the world. So I think system change makes you feel both uneasy in the size of the problem, but it can also, once you have the strategies and ideas in place and knowing how you can start contributing, it can also stop you worrying and stop you feeling anxious as well.
And we're really curious about inspiration. So if you could talk a bit more about either who or what inspires you or is inspiring you at the moment in your work.
It's quite interesting because I was thinking about inspiration yesterday, and it doesn't really come down to an individual or individual people. It's something in the collective people coming together, and there's something spark when you're just having a good conversation with somebody. You're just having a conversation that goes that little bit further and you get new insights from. So what inspires me the most is when I get that moment of new insight, new thought, new idea of how to do something different that I hadn't seen before, mainly through conversations. It hardly ever happens to me sitting by myself. It usually happens when I'm just in conversation, in flow with people.
you know that we're kind of doing this investigation into systems change. What haven't I asked you that's interesting?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It's been a good list of questions.
Is there any area that you feel that's important to you that I haven't touched on?
Not that I can think of right now. You've touched on, I'm just trying to think through this. No, you've touched on quite a lot of different things. Yeah.
Yeah? Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I could keep on talking all day. No, I don't know really. Sorry, I can't think of anything different.
One more actually.
Yeah.
What's been your journey to working in systems change? So normally the question we ask for people who are working in specific sectors is, have you always wanted to change the system that you're working on?
Yeah.
But you're working across systems. So how did you become a systems changer?
My journey to system change was very much based in my love of geography. And what I loved about geography was not the individual bits of it, but how it could help you understand the world as a whole. So when I did geography at university, I didn't choose modules that kind of burrowed down deeper. I chose modules that looked at the broad interconnections between things. So I've always been somebody who's been inspired and excited by how things join up, how we can add things up for something bigger. That led me to the world of sustainability. But when you're in the world of sustainability, I've always been really interested by the relationships. I really like talking and being with people and working out how to bring people together. And I did a lot of facilitation, and that led me into seeing sort of the system change world as an answer to the sustainability challenge. So, yeah, my route in was through geography, and then sustainability, and then more about facilitation as well.
And so, because when we first met, you were working at WWF, and I'm interested in that transition from working in an organisation which has a specific set of goals to working in an organisation that's about systems change across sectors.
My role at WWF was in the education team, and part of our role was to understand how sustainability could be embedded within education. But by asking that question, I guess the way that I think is, what is the bigger thing we're adding up to? And our programme then evolved into essentially an education system change programme. And I was always searching for the bigger question. So if we did some work in a classroom saying, well, what have we learnt about this that could change the way teaching and learning happens across the education system? Or when we did some work with a whole school and their strategy, you could ask, well, what does this mean for schools across the piece? And then we worked with government, and then we're saying, well, what's the strategic framework that government sets that enables more schools to get this? So one of my routes into system change was just about asking bigger questions, asking what can we learn from the experiment, and how does that help the bigger system, in this case education. And that led me to work in WWF on their business systems and their community systems, and really looking at them as enablers of change for WWF.
That's great.
A systems approach is where we think we can know everything and we have to know before we act, whereas the more systemic approach is where we just have to get on an experiment with a good enough knowledge of what's going on.